here. And I'm going to get rid of some people's video. So we have heard from Tom Abello. He's going to be a little bit late dealing with an issue. Don Mancius will not be here today. He's on vacation. Pat Strauch, you all saw an email from him, hopefully this morning. Sounds like he's got a full plate. Yay for kids' weddings. And Melissa needs to leave at 11:15 today. And so that's the news I have. And this is our second to last meeting. And you'll see that, I'm not even quite sure why I made an agenda, because really there's sort of only one item on the agenda. And I've been kind of going round and round trying to think about the most logical way to tackle this. We could certainly go from page 1 to page 40, whatever. But I think there may be a couple of overarching issues that could be helpful to address first. And so let me just jump into one of them, because it may be fresh in everyone's minds. I think to some extent, Patrick's, did you all see the email from Patrick this morning? Okay. I think to some extent, the first item in Patrick's email reflects a comment that I also received just directly, that wasn't shared with the rest of the group. And I think if I can capture it succinctly, it's a question of how targeted are these recommendations to particular users or particular interest groups, and how do we make sure that we strike a balance between having the recommendations be as specific as possible without so specifically prescribing what needs to be done that it may unintentionally exclude other individuals from being able to either improve practices or something else. So I just want to raise that as a general issue and make a recommendation on something, because I think this could be a big topic that it may not make sense to be most productively dealt with at this meeting. I think there could be an opportunity to have a subgroup of those who are interested in just honing in on this a little bit better, getting together at the very beginning of next week. And by beginning, I mean hopefully Tuesday, no later than. So I'm going to leave it there for a moment. I want to turn it over to Amanda as co-chair and let her offer some comments in that regard, and then we can get going.
Yes, thanks, Jody. Well, I just want to say in general, reading this document, I think it's come a long way, and I really appreciate all of the input that people have taken the time to submit, and I thank Jody for taking the time to try to incorporate all of that input. And I do agree, and I've had some conversation with Forest Service staff about just wanting to make sure that we are using language that's inclusive and also really in the spirit of, we want these strategies to be broadly applied. We want to have the most impact that we possibly can. And so we think there just are a few areas within the document where we could improve a little bit on that. And so I did want to just, since Dawn's not on the call today, would it be okay to hear from Patty, just from her perspective? In saying that, I also am happy to be part of a subgroup that would work on that early next week.
Are you all okay with hearing briefly from Patty? Okay. All right, go ahead. Hi, Patty.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Jody and Amanda said, that you guys have come a long way and you've got quite a document going. And looking through the document, I was reflecting, looking back as to the actual directive of the group, which is to develop incentives that increase carbon storage on the 10 to 10,000 acre land ownership category, by a widespread adoption of forest practices that increase carbon sequestration. So the end goal is to engage as many landowners as possible, to get as many acres impacted and educated with their landowners, getting them involved. And in the spirit of strategies to have the greatest impact overall, it's imperative that the language of the outcomes just not be restrictive. And I'm really happy to hear about a possible subgroup to explore that. Some of the language presented is a little bit exclusive, and you know, we got to look at, when it comes to this group, these programs and these outcomes need to be accessible and equitable. And at the core of the Forest Service, we serve all groups, right? And I just want to, you know, emphasize that again, it's about equity and accessibility, and not to put in any kind of restrictions that will that could possibly prevent landowners from being engaged. So that's my broad message.
Could you provide an example?
Of what I'm talking about as far as restrictive, or?
Yes.
So I think, you know, as you all got the message from Pat Strout, and I did as well this morning. So looking at, for example, under a suite of forest practices to be incentivized, I see that under, let's see, I don't have the document up right now, but on page 10, if you all want to go there, under suite of practices incentivized, I guess we'll just dive into some of the details. So in particular, utilize timber harvesting contractors that are audited to third-party performance standards. So there are other ways to promote the message of, I think, to training contractors to sustainable practices and aligning landowners with professionals in a general way, as opposed to basically making it specific to one group. And I just think there needs to be more broad language of this, and that's where Jody suggested a subgroup. That's where this language could be explored as to how that is expressed, as to what, how specific do you want to be in this language.
Let me take Karen's hand up. Let me take Karen.
Greetings all, good to see you. You know, I'm just gonna say that I came prepared to go through the document, and I'm finding this a little jolting now to have a subgroup being planned. I think if there is this concern about having language that's too restrictive, I would encourage us to, as we go through the document, to identify those. I'm kind of, I'll be honest, reluctant to have another subgroup if we only have one more meeting after this, and this is the time to identify issues. So I'm just feeling a little confused by this.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? One thought that I could suggest is that we start going through the document in one order or another, and I can offer up a couple of suggestions on how to do that. And we circle back closer to the end of the meeting as to whether there is a need or not to be tackling these issues in subgroup. What do you all think of that? Let me take Dana, go ahead, and then Mark.
I wasn't raising my hand to respond to that question. Jody, but I will. I agree with Karen that it appears that we are now responding to an email we received within an hour ago. And I'm a little concerned that there's been opportunity for comment and conversation in this group on this very topic over the last 6 months. And now we've got an email that's come before the group in the last hour. And now we're suddenly doing an about face and making a recommendation on a subgroup. And I'm a little concerned about that. I'm also concerned that we're now singling out specific areas. And I guess I would ask Patty a further question: that does she also have the same concern about funding that's going to go to another group for forest management plans, because that's also been singled out. So I guess, where are we going with this? And I guess I'd rather go to with Karen's suggestion, and we kind of go through this, and I'd rather not reflect on something that should have been brought up, I think, months ago.
Mark, thank you, Dana.
I think I feel similarly, that because this is the last meeting of the task force that will produce the version that goes out for public comment, that it'd be nice if we can surface any substantive concerns today and address them, even if we don't get the final language, so that all of us are clear. If there are people that are going to work on language on a particular issue, we know where it is, we know the direction they're going, even if we don't have the final words.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Alec.
I agree.
Okay. All right, then I think that's a clear message. Then let me suggest, so Patty, thank you for your comment. I don't know what your availability is. I know personally, I think that with Don not here, and where he would have represented Maine Forest Service perspective, to the extent that you're able to stay on, I think you have another commitment at some point. I would find that helpful. How do the rest of you feel about that, in terms of Patty sort of representing Don essentially in this meeting? If you're uncomfortable with that, please feel free to private message me, so that you're not feeling like you're the bad guy. Otherwise, why don't I suggest a couple of things? I'm happy to start, moving through this document in whatever order you find to be most logical. We could start on page 1. The alternative would be that we start with action item number 9, which is what's the goal? Because arguably, you ought to be clear on the goal, and then make sure that all the recommendations that you're making support that goal, support you achieving that goal. So I can argue it either way, or another idea. Do any of you have a preference? Does it feel more logical to just start on page 1, or do this kind of item number 9 and then head back to page 1 once you understand what your goal is? I think the only thing, other thing I will say is I want to acknowledge the incredible amount of hard work that Adam and Logan and the rest of you who worked on that subgroup put in. And it's not a small piece of work. And I want to make sure that you have time, you give it justice, and that we not leave it to the last 25 minutes of the meeting. So what's your thoughts? What would you like?
Maybe it would be helpful, Jody, to start off with, if people have big concerns, to deal with some of those up front. And for example, Pat Strouk's concern, which we've now, I think, dealt with, and then perhaps go to more detailed stuff.
So I've also received a one-on-one comment saying start on page 1. We've got Alex's suggestion. Can I hear from a few others?
I'm ultimately fine with either. I think if we do go page by page, let's make sure we keep our conversation focused on the concerns that we think are substantial. We may have I know I have some other word change recommendations, but that I don't think merit discussion. We could skip some of those kinds of things.
And from a process standpoint, let me just suggest that similar to how the last meeting was handled, I think I asked if all of you could get me your individual, like little edits by Tuesday of the following week. Because of a constraint that I have at the end of next week, being out of the country, I need to finish this document by Thursday afternoon. So I'm going to ask that if you have any of those minor editorial things, that I get them on Monday, so that I have enough time to work on them and get a draft out. Go ahead, Karen.
Well, you know, I tend to be sort of linear, so I have a preference for just going through, but I would say we all might impose on ourselves the responsibility of bringing up the larger issues, with the idea that then we commit to Jody to get edits, like grammatical type edits by her deadline. And that Jody, you exercise your facilitation skill to move us along if you're finding us sort of puddling on a certain.
Sure. Anybody object to that approach? Okay. All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Then why don't we start page 5 or page 6, and let me know if you have any concerns, large concerns over the overarching principles, or item number, well, I shouldn't say just page 6. Let's say item number 1, which had some substantial revisions as well. Again, thanks to Adam. Go ahead, Karen.
I don't think this is just an edit. That's why I'm somewhat nervously bringing it up. But on page 5, the second bullet, the second line from the bottom of that bullet, I found that the phrase "the increased growth rate" was possibly not correct. So I'm suggesting that the last 2 lines in that second bullet read, "resulting in greater carbon storage, which also increases the opportunity to store more carbon in long life forest products," and delete "the increased growth rate." Because I don't know that that's completely accurate the way it's worded. But with that edit, I think it would be.
I'll take Adam in a moment, but I just want to make sure that
my suggestion, I think it's going to help everybody. Is there a way that we can share the document on the screen? And so it might just be easier to follow along.
I prefer not to do that. I think I need to see all of you in order to gauge where you're all at. I think the page numbers and the lines on the page are pretty clear. It's the second to last line and the second bullet of page 5. Are you all okay with that? It's difficult to sort of know where you're all at without seeing you. Okay. So the essence being, Karen, could you just paraphrase that your concern is that by focusing strictly on growth rate, it doesn't capture the point?
Yeah, I did run it by a forester this morning. The way it now reads, you can have increased growth rates on younger stands, and that doesn't necessarily increase the opportunity to store more carbon in long life forest products if you're cutting the smaller stands for other purposes. So it wasn't completely accurate in my humble opinion, but by just deleting those few words, it would be make sense. That, you know, and so it wasn't just a tiny edit. I wanted to make sure folks were comfortable with it.
Do the rest of you understand the essence of that change? Number 1, and then are you comfortable with it? Barry, you don't understand.
No, I don't quite. Can you say it again, like what you would want the new words to be? I didn't quite understand the essence of it.
And the piece of Karen that I didn't understand was I wasn't sure if you meant comma resulting in, which would mean it was a 7-line sentence.
Right, it would have a comma.
Okay.
And so it would be a longer sentence.
Yep.
Attaching the very last sentence to the second to last sentence, and it would read, and by delayed harvests that allow trees to mature into older forest, resulting in greater carbon storage, comma, which also increases the opportunity to store more carbon in long-lived forest products.
Oh, so just which, comma, which.
Comma, which also allows, and so that's my small edit.
Okay. Concerns about that, anybody? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Other comments about these overarching principles that, you know, sort of substantive, not minor word changing. Not that that one was, but. Alec, go ahead.
Okay, we're into the details here. So at the top of page 5 in the 4th line down, it seems to me that we ought to say while maintaining harvest levels at the end of that sentence.
Okay. Any concerns about that? Okay. Others? Other comments on this page? All right, then why don't we move on to section 1, sort of taken as a whole, which covers pages 6, 7, and 8. Adam, you might want to, if you would be willing, talk a little bit with us. Adam and I went back and forth a lot. He did a lot. He tried to respond to a lot of the group's specific concerns about, you know, lack of explanation of what some of the terms meant in the tables. That's why you see the additional on page 8, all of those descriptors underneath table 2. Anything else that you want to highlight, Adam, in terms of major changes here?
No, again, and I want to also just acknowledge both Don and Jeremy Frank, the Forest Service, which helped me on this. You know, we've been talking about this section for 5 months now, right? And it's apparent that we have some data that allows us to probably develop quite a large bound. We've tried to tighten the language enough to make that clear that it's probably at least this and no more than this, right? And so, but emphasize a little bit more the at least this. The other thing where there's points of confusion is what we're actually talking about in terms of land ownership group, right? And people, we try to be more clear that some data comes from National Woodland Owner Survey, which is not the same as everyone that falls into that is not necessarily the same that falls into a 10 to 10,000 acres. And so we've tried to be a bit more clear about that, about why there might be that differentiation and aspect also that we're not, there was also some, I think some people raised the question of family forest owners, right? We're not just thinking about family forest owners in this group as well. So we tried to be clear about that when we're distinguishing between that, but also acknowledging that it's hard to exactly say how much of the small corporate versus family there are as well. But hopefully it's more clear now. Hopefully there's no more outstanding acronyms and things like that. Yeah.
That's great. What I would also just remind folks is that kind of the backup rationale or further information in regards to section 1 is Appendix B. So if you also sort of consider if you had any major concerns about pages 34 through 39, is that fair to say, Adam, that essentially all of the information on pages 34 through 39, what is now Appendix B, is kind of backup material to support what is in section 1?
Correct.
Karen.
I mean, this is minor, but I've always had a bit of trouble reading the numbers in the bright colors of the red and the blue, and on page 7. And I don't know if others have had that difficulty, but in the final report, maybe a softer tone. I'm so sorry.
I think again, for consistency with every other table here, we should get rid of the colors.
Agreed.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm so sorry to bring up such a minor thing.
Great. Barry.
Yeah, I had still some questions. There's more definition in that table 2 on page 8, which is helpful, but I still have some questions for clarification. Like when you talk about the stocking value of at least 10 base 100. I mean, I feel like I should know what that means, but I don't know what that means. And if I don't know, there's probably other people that don't know either. Are we talking basal area or what are we talking about? And then also there still is no definition of what is large, medium, and small diameter trees. Like what type of inches are we talking about for those categories?
Any feedback, Adam, on that? This is page 8.
Yeah, we can just add more from FIA. We're trying to be as clear as possible, but as anyone knows, FIA likes to spend 2 paragraphs explaining everything. So it's a good point, Barry. We'll try to add more to make that more clear.
Yeah, just to like quantify these vague terms, like what's medium to me is a word that really means nothing. Or, you know, base 100, base 10, maybe if you could figure out what they're saying and put into more concrete terms.
Yeah, I don't think we need more. I think we need clearer. So
Yeah,
it
clarity
sounds
is what I'm
like-
looking for.
Sounds like
Yeah.
tree diameter is, and what do they mean by at least 10? 10 what? Mark, go ahead. You're on mute.
Thank you. This is just a reference to the appendix. I personally didn't find figure B1 added much value. It's from one of the sources that's cited. And I think the text reference there is useful, but I think that figure could just be skipped.
You didn't like all the lines? Karen.
Yeah, I agree. I was gonna ask for more explication around that.
Anybody want to keep it other than Adam?
That's Jeremy's doing, not me. I'm gonna pass the buck.
Okay, let me just make a note to get rid of the reference to B1. Okay. Anything else on section 1 or appendix B? Okay, then let's move on to page 9. Items, let's take 2 and 3 together.
Wait, we're done with appendix B altogether now?
Not if you don't want to be.
Okay, well, yeah, I was looking at the numbers in the chart on page 36. I couldn't, maybe I'm just very detail oriented. I couldn't figure out how they added up. Like where did the totals come from? I tried adding up, you know, like you have the 0 to 10,000 acre class, which we're looking for. And then the 10,000 plus and unknown size. And I couldn't get any of the, like the subcategories to add up to the total.
So you're saying if you look at a column, if you add up a column, you don't get to the total number?
Right.
Oh, interesting.
Minor problem.
Yeah, that is the problem.
Well, I mean, just any of this report that we're sending out, I feel like I or any of the members of the committee should be able to explain it to anyone that has a question about it. And if I have a question about it, I surely can't explain anything to anybody else.
I might be wrong on this, but my impression was that if you don't include the 10 to 10,000 known, that everything above that would be the total. That 10 to 10,000 known is a subset of the total, and it would
No,
be,
I tried lots of different combinations. I couldn't really get anything to work out. I mean, it was late last night. I was doing it too. Maybe that was it. But I don't know. Someone else add up those numbers and see if they can.
All right, we'll
Figure
check.
out-
Maybe it got pasted wrong again because Excel, whatever, convert. And the other thing is that it actually, we need to, there's no units on the top row either. So that needs to be.
Right, right, yeah.
So thought that's what you're going to say is it can add up and it comes to 16 million, but 16 million what?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and then still back on appendix B, on page 38, the as for spatial data services response. I thought that that whole top of the page is a little bit TMI. I don't think that we need to include that in the report. And the same thing with the numbers 2 and 3 on the top of page 39.
Let me give Adam an opportunity to reply because, you know, I think to his credit, and obviously we pull out anything that you all don't think is important, but I think he was really trying to be extremely responsive to all of the questions that came in about how did you come up with these numbers? This is really how you came up with these numbers. Now, maybe it doesn't matter because when you read how he came up with the numbers, nobody's going to understand it. But Adam, please weigh in further.
Yeah, it's our attempt to be as transparent as possible as how we came up, and then the challenges are really the caveats that are trying to basically, when people are like, I don't believe these numbers, which we've had this discussion. Well, this is the best we can do right now, but we're at least acknowledging that this is a very imperfect science. So we felt, as the people who calculated that, we wanted to cover our tracks. And the other thing I'm learning from this process is there's other states that are trying to figure this out too. So I recognize that, you know, this is for the state of Maine and whatever, but this sort of cryptic stuff could actually be useful for others I'm talking with in other states who are trying to find out the same question, right? So the more we have somewhere publicly available information to share, this is hard, this is not easy, you know, you can't just call up the Forest Service and get exactly what you want, might be easier from a sort of public service perspective. So that was sort of our decision why we keep this in, recognizing that, you know, there'll be 10 people that actually read these page and a half.
Okay, well, that makes sense, and I'll take back my comment from that and maybe switch it the other direction, saying if you're leaving it into just some more clarification, like on item 3 on the top of page 39, owner class code of 45. What does that mean? And then table before the percentages. What are we talking? Percentages of what? Basal area, volume, or what? If you could just like clarify or define that. So I totally get that you know, that this is a very inexact science, kind of like pinning Jello to the wall, and you're trying to explain what you did. And I think that is a very good reason to keep it in there. But just, you know, if you're going to do that, kind of clarify a few things too.
Stacy, go right ahead.
I probably should have taken my hand down when Barry said leave it back in, but I was just going to say I think we should definitely leave this in. It's in the appendix, so I think we can have more technical detail in the appendix for people who have questions. And so, as Adam said, maybe it's only 10 people, but those 10 people will have some of their questions answered here, and I do think that's worthy to keep in.
Okay. Any other comments on Appendix B then? I'm seeing a thumbs up from Ryan. Okay. Awesome. Then, Adam, if you were able to just maybe send me one last, you know, email with a few items clarified that you heard today, ideally Monday if you were able to, but do what you can do. So let's move on then to page 9. And I would, yeah, page 9, 10, and the very top of 11. So we're dealing with sections 2 and 3. Because I wouldn't imagine you have more comments on section 2, but maybe you do. So this is really, you know, I did receive some, I'm sure you saw by rereading the forest practices. I did receive a number of suggestions on some tweaking of wording, so I want to make sure that you're comfortable with this wording of these practices. What's already been raised is a concern about utilized timber harvesting contractors that are audited to a third-party performance standard. Tom, go ahead, and then Barry, and then, well, and then Alec. And Mark. Tom Doak, we can't hear you at all.
Sorry, there, how's that?
Great.
So this is specifically on the number 3, identify a suite of climate-friendly management practices. So to me, and I guess this probably applies to a couple other places in the document. I think the way we're going to reach the most number of people is if we can identify what we mean by those practices and then expose those people to those practices and say, here we go. And so I think that part you mentioned, Jody, is actually pretty limiting. And I do agree that with the comment from Patrick that is, and Patty, that this is limiting. My suggestion would be to change that bullet. This is the 5th bullet under practice sustainable for harvesting, is utilize professionals trained in climate-friendly practices. So now you're talking about people that we have that have gone through a training that is, that has identified the things that we care about. And then there are a number of ways to get to that level. And the example I would use is BMPs. We've done a lot of work with training people to BMPs, and the results have been extremely good. And so to use that model, now it becomes available to everybody. Now you've got the same message going to everybody. And I think you can do a broad, foresters, loggers, anybody involved. Landowners will take the BMP train, will take that climate-friendly training. And that's how you broaden this a reach. So that would be my suggestion on that.
Great, thank you, Tom. Barry, and then Alec.
Yeah, I would what Tom just said is great. I totally echo that too. And just on a general note, I do certainly support more inclusivity wherever it needs to be put into this. And I like that comparison to the BMPs and the training process for that, and training people and training them together. Why not? So I think the inclusivity part of it is great. On page 9, under number 3, kind of the middle of that big paragraph, it says it currently says a task force believes that more active forest management is likely to be necessary to achieve increased sequestration. I think we should take out likely to be, because that just those are waffle words that say, well, why are we even here doing this in the first place? I mean, we're talking about improving management, so I don't think we should have those 3 words likely to be in there.
Got it. I'm going to rely on subsequent comments to comment on previous comments if you disagree strongly with them. Alec, then Mark, then Barrett, sorry, Dana.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Barry's last comment. I completely agree with that. And I would change the rest of the sentence as well. And I would say increase carbon sequestration and storage while maintaining harvest. And the comment about sequestration and storage is something that I think, Jody, ought to be reflected throughout the document. Sequestration is the rate at which you're adding more wood. Storage is what you're storing, which includes the increased sequestration, but also includes material that was sequestered earlier. So I would change that sentence to include Barry's comment. So 10 to 10,000 acres is necessary to achieve increased carbon sequestration and storage while maintaining harvest.
Mm-hmm. And are you suggesting, just for clarification, that I scrub the whole document and wherever it's logical
appropriate
to add and storage when we're talking about sequestration, wherever it's.
Yes, because I think people get confused about this, and it's important to make the distinction that both things are important. Basically, sequestration is your growth rate. It either goes up, down, stays the same. And then storage is what you're leaving in the forest. And then with regard to the comment on the timber harvesting contractors, why not go with a combination of what Tom is suggesting, which is more general. And I agree that casting a wider net is good, but then using what is here as an example, a specific example that would be helpful to people.
Thank you, Alec. Mark, go ahead.
Thanks. In that introductory paragraph, I too had some concern with the sentence that Barry suggested changes to. I like the idea of deleting likely to be. I actually would delete necessary and change it to an important strategy. And I think that's somewhat of a credibility issue for us, that we need to be sort of intellectually honest everywhere we can be through this. And that's not the only possible approach to increase carbon sequestration and storage. It's the one that we are recommending. We think it's important, but that's not the same thing as it being necessary. In the previous sentence, I also would suggest we change the reference to smaller ownerships are generally overstocked. And I know that there's no way we completely avoid technical language here, but I think overstocked is something that many readers of this document, we hope that this will be read by policymakers, for instance, are not going to be familiar with forestry language. And from a carbon perspective, those older stands are doing important things. So I would suggest we change that sentence to just say, and that smaller ownerships, particularly in the southern half of the state, are generally less likely to have been harvested in recent decades.
Thank you, Mark. Dana, go ahead.
Thanks, Jody. I'm not in disagreement with any of the other pieces that folks have brought up, except that fifth bullet under practice sustainable harvesting. So I'm going to disagree with Tom, and I'm actually going to agree with Alec that I think it's an amalgamation of both. I want to refer folks back to the executive order. So the executive order is very clear and very specific regarding harvesting recommendations. It says identify incentives for high quality on the ground performance by loggers. And I'm not going to finish that because it has to do with the type of equipment that's used. So performance is everything. Verification on the ground of practices is everything to a carbon process and carbon program for it to be validated and to be creditable. And many of the recommendations that are above practice sustainable harvesting on page 10 can't be verified unless there is some type of third-party audit that is done, so that if these practices are going to be recommended, there needs to be verification at the end. I don't disagree that training is part of it. However, training is not verifiable. I can take a training program and get a credential. Doesn't mean a damn thing of I'm going to go out there and I'm going to achieve the outcome that's desired, especially if no one's going to come behind me and verify that it was actually done. So auditing and third-party auditing is absolutely necessary. And the contractor, I'm going to remind folks, it's the contractor that's hired, whether that's a licensed forester or it's a logging contractor, is going to have ultimate responsibility for implementation. It's not a trained operator, and it's not because they went to a training program. A training program is only as good as that operator, but it's really only as good as the company they work for and whether or not there is some teeth to a third-party audit. So I'm in agreement with Alec that I think training could be added, but I don't want to see anything removed, because that bullet that I'm referring to is actually a direct reference to the executive order, and it's verifiable proof for whatever program is created here. And that has to be there in the end.
I want to be clear that each of you is stating your opinion. I would argue that there's not must in any of this. I want to be clear about what's in this particular directive from the executive order. It says identify incentives for high quality on the ground and performance. It does not say identify and come up with an audit system or come up with a verifiable program. It may be what all of you want. And if all of you want that in there, then we should put it in there. But I just want to make sure that we're not misrepresenting what is in the executive order. Patty, let me take you next.
Jody, can I just interrupt for a moment?
Please.
So as context to that, remember that came from our lands group.
Understood.
That specific piece. And we as a group in that lands group went through this entire process and talked about the importance of third-party audits. And that's why that executive order exists. I understand the point you're making, but there's context to this as to where that came from.
Thank you. Patty and then Tom.
So yeah, I just wanted to, on that same point I had brought up earlier and what we're discussing, that bullet, I would suggest, and this is in the document further, is possibly language such as including a focus on logging contractors to incentivize high quality harvesting practices, as this has direct bearing on stand quality and ultimately on forest carbon storage. And that is further in the plan. And this would address that exclusivity issue.
Are you suggesting that what you just read be added to the forest practice on page 10?
I'm saying instead of specifically, so for the replacing the utilized timber harvesting contractors that we're talking about, that bullet, replace it with including a focus on logging contractors to incentivize high quality harvesting practices.
Could you write your suggestion in the chat, Patty?
Yep.
Thank you. Tom and then Karen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still back to that fifth bullet. We're going to, and there's a couple other places. We're going to limit the number of a lot of these loggers that work on small landowners aren't in that program, and but they're doing very good work. And I think what we're doing here is limiting our reach to people and to foresters and to loggers, and we need to get to as many people as we can. And the way it was solved at BMP is that actually the Forest Service went out and did some monitoring of BMPs. And Patty, I don't know if the Forest Service still does that, but after the training went out on the ground, and so the auditing was done by the state. And again, it wasn't about turning anybody in. It was how much our BMPs being used. Do people understand them? Do they need some extra help? Those kind of things. And it casts a broad net, and that really has worked. And I'm worried that what we're doing here is limiting this thing to a small subset of folks, when we really need to be reaching all of them, not just a small group. And if they're third-party certified, they may not be the ones that need the help as much as those that are not. So I don't understand the logic here. So I think I want this to be successful, and to do that, we have to reach a whole bunch of people.
Thank you. Karen and then Dana, and then I'm going to take the pulse of the group so that we don't, spend an excessive amount of time on this item at the expense of other parts of this plan. Go ahead, Karen.
My comment is not as detailed wording, but rather an observation that perhaps I think what I'm hearing is concerns that somehow by having recommendations that are desirable, and at the end of this section, it says that these should be encouraged, promoted, and incentivized, to just emphasize, that they're not exclusive. I'd rather us have sort of some statement to that effect than try to necessarily take some of the power out of the thought that's into these. So if there's some way perhaps to ease concerns in that regard, I just throw that out as a suggestion.
Thank you. Dana, go ahead.
Thanks, Jody. So I want to remind Tom, with all due respect, so we're talking about a very small subset of landowners who are going to be in this. We're not talking about landowners throughout the state who are all going to be part of this at the end of the day. So I'd say there's going to be a subset of landowners, and those landowners there's going to be a subset of contractors. So I think we're talking apples to apples with that. So trying to make this open to all contractors that may not be audited and verified might be challenging. I'll also say that any carbon program is also going to require verification. And that verification is going to happen on the ground. And that could happen through a forest certification program. It could happen through FSC. It could happen through SFI. It could happen through tree farm. But I'd also say it could happen with a third-party certified contractor. So those third-party certification programs, when we say third-party performance standard, right now, FSC, SFI are all recognizing third-party certified contractors, just like a actual standalone third-party certification program for contractors. So I think we have to look in a bigger picture here of really what we're talking about. And that subset you mentioned is just as specific to the landowner community as it is to the contracting community. And I'll just leave it with this. If we're going to get into a nitpicking on this one group, I'm going to have the same issues brought up when we get into other areas of this that have funding dedicated to other groups that have been recommended. So I guess I'll just say, if we're going to talk about it here, we're going to have the same discussion when we get later on other funding streams that have been recommended.
Amanda, and then I'm going to pivot us with a summary. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, I just want to observe, we're not talking about excluding anybody. We're talking about being more, the need to be more inclusive. And I think also reflect the reality of how the Forest Service works, that they work for everyone, and that they would be striving to, ensure that all professionals are trained to help to implement these strategies that we come up with. So I just, I want to recognize that there is, that reality of how the Forest Service does serve all stakeholders. And I think that's what we're, Patty and I, what we've been thinking and talking about is just how the language can be more reflective of that reality.
Thank you. Let me tell you what I'm hearing. And I want you all to turn to page 2, if you would, for a moment, which is about the ground rules and the decision-making process that's part of this task force, where wherever possible, you're striving to make decisions by consensus, and where it's not possible, that the recommendations supported by the majority will be advanced. Obviously, this is still in draft form. You're going to be sending it out for public comment, and you may hear a lot or nothing on this issue, who knows. But what I'm hearing today is that the consensus is to broaden this language. And I'm hearing one individual in particular who would prefer that it remain as is. So I am going to suggest that that we broaden that language, that we have it go out to public comment with something broader, that I'm happy to take additional written ideas on what that look like, but I also wrote down the suggestions made today at the meeting, as well as what you all see in the chat that Patty put in there. That's an option as well. So I do think we should pivot to the next issue because we've got a lot to cover. But that is my recommendation based on what I think we've established as sort of a group process. Alec, if it's a process question.
Well, I understand that.
Okay.
Why can't we do both? Broaden the language and use this as a specific example of how that broadened language could be implemented.
You've made that recommendation, duly noted. And so that's among the options of how I redraft that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Let's move on so we can argue about something else. And
Okay. Joe, just, this is still on page 10, but it's away from the inclusivity stuff. It's another bullet that we've had before that didn't appear in this one, the maintain carbon stocking by shifting harvest to thinning and overstock stands as one of the other bullet items under conduct intermediate treatments. And was that specifically left out, or do you think does the group kind of think that's been absorbed into some of the existing bullets?
yeah, I received two comments after, written comments from two different committee members that I had excluded two recommended practices from the original list. And by redrafting it, I sort of had eliminated them, and that there were two individuals on the committee who felt that they shouldn't have been eliminated. I'm now sort of forgetting exactly which ones they were. Were they increased stocking on understock stands? And then what you said was the second one, was it?
Yeah, maintain carbon stocking by shifting harvest to thinning and overstock stands.
Yeah, are you suggesting that you feel like it's redundant? What's your?
No, I'm suggesting keeping it in there, but I'm not gonna throw a tantrum if it's not in there, if people think that's already covered. But I mean, basically the idea is that to maintain carbon stocking, instead of like cutting some forests over and over, to focus on shifting and thinning the overstock stands, so you're improving the growth of the remaining forest and not having some forests that are just remain understock because they keep getting cut.
Barry, this is just an idea, but what would you think about adding to that second bullet where it now says conduct thinning in immature stands? Say something like immature and or overstocked stands.
I don't see which bullet you're referring
So
to.
the conduct intermediate treatments, the second bullet. is
Right,
about
okay.
thinning. We could put a reference there so that's not limited to immature stands, but it's immature or overstocked stands.
Sure.
Alec, go ahead.
So I agree with that idea, but I would add in that one of the reasons for doing that is to maintain harvest and to stimulate growth.
Right.
Because there's two different ideas here, okay? You're thinning to do both things. You're thinning to maintain wood harvest, and you're thinning to stimulate the growth of the residual.
I mean, that was a bullet we came up with before, so we could just put it back in if unless someone objects to it.
So adding maintain harvest to that.
Yeah,
bullet as
or
well.
maintain carbon stocking by, I can send you the wording of it, but it was right out of the earlier draft.
Yeah, could you send it to me, because
Sure.
I'm getting confused with the
Yeah,
rewrite.
I'll send it to you.
Okay, any concerns about that general concept, even so we're not wordsmithing, just like the general point behind it? Okay, anything else on any of the other, so we can move on from the specific forest management practices? Anything else on forest management practices? And welcome, Tom Abello. Okay, then let's dig into section 4, which starts on page 11 and goes through the middle of page 15. Sigh. Whose sigh was that? Alec, go ahead. And then
I
Mark.
guess this is actually still part of 3, but this, as I recall, is the first place where I noticed that NRCS comes up, but then it comes up repeatedly throughout the document. And my comment is this, that the NRCS programs are one of 2 likely sources of funding for actually getting this done. And funding is going to be critical. It's not just education. That's important, necessary, but not sufficient in my view. You need to have incentives for people to do this stuff. So there can be incentives provided by the voluntary carbon markets. And then the other logical source is the NRCS. The NRCS program has, despite their valiant efforts to get people engaged, is undersubscribed in terms of small landowners, and has not really reached the great bulk of the area that is owned by these folks. If we're going to make strides in changing that, I think, and there are some examples where things have been freed up, and I'm thinking specifically of the 2 RCPP programs that are going on in Maine now, one in northwestern Maine aimed at habitat improvements, and the other one throughout the salmon watersheds to increase fish passage. Those are examples of things where the normal process has been replaced with an RCPP, Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And I think that there needs to be a fairly substantial modification of the NRCS programs if we're ever going to reach the great bulk of these people. It needs to be made more landowner friendly, frankly. And I would suggest that we may want to recommend that something along the lines of the Nova Scotia program, which we've talked about before, that model could be adopted by the NRCS as a way that they do their business. And I think that that comes up in a number of different places in this document. And I would suggest that we go in that direction. A customer-oriented effort within the NRCS programs to reach far more people, get far more work done on the ground.
Alec, and then I'll take you, Mark, but I tried, and now I'm having a difficult time finding it, to sort of capture the essence of your concerns around the need to kind of restructure the NRCS program. I tried to capture it in here somewhere, and I'm just at a loss as to where I put it. But I think, given that it's a federal program, I'm having difficulty figuring out what's the best way if this group as a whole thinks that this is a really, important point to convey. What is the best way of having a singular state entity, a task force, impact the structure of a federal program? And if you don't feel like I've captured sort of your overarching points that you forwarded to me earlier, you should let me know more specifically, but I thought that I had. Let me just move on to Mark for a second. But
Jody, did I just, on page 12, second to the last bullet, is that what you're referring to? Increase alignment of NRCS?
There's some language in the first paragraph on page 11. The last sentence has some language about NRCS cost share practices developed and specific to carbon sequestration and administrative requirements must be simplified.
Yeah. Where is that? I'm sorry.
First paragraph, page 11.
Right. Yeah, so at top of page 11 was the best that I felt like I could do with your comments. And I'm gonna take Alex. Sorry, Mark, I just want to wrestle this one.
Okay, I don't disagree that you covered and you raised it a number of points throughout the document.
Yeah.
I just think that we have to hit it harder. Okay, and so what I would suggest is that the administration should go to the state conservationist to start with, then should go to the chief of the NRCS and should go to the Maine congressional delegation and say that these are things that would be helpful to your program. This is all going to help NRCS reach more people and get them more credit for the good work that they do.
So if the rest of you I would first need to hear to what extent the rest of you agree with that. So if subsequent comments could maybe circle back to that. And if you all, seem to be largely in agreement with that, I would appreciate any thoughts that you have, Alec, or others on how to word that more directly. Mark, go ahead. Then I couldn't tell whether it was Tom or Patty who went first.
So my comment is not related to Alex. If Patty and Tom are responding to that, I'd be happy to let them go first.
Sure, thank you. Tom, why don't I take you and then Patty?
Great, thanks, Jody. Yeah, I think generally, I think that's a good idea. I think we can work on the language for the report here about the steps and make it a little bit more specific about the role of the state working with the Biden administration to do some or encourage some of the changes that you've articulated, Jody, on page 11.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Patty. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jody. Yeah, just wanted to agree with Alec that it's fine to have stronger language, because in we can certainly, there's limitations to what this group can do for NRCS funding, but some of the processes are in place as far as moving towards alignment, and it would take speaking with the delegation to move that forward for a higher focus on carbon practices within NRCS.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, that'd be helpful. Alec, Tom, anything that you could offer in terms of that language. Mark, go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm looking at section 4 and the 2 bullets that are the task force recommending a 2-pronged approach to developing a forest carbon program.
Mm-hmm.
And I would strongly suggest we change the first bullet. As Patty referenced earlier today, our ultimate goal is we're trying to rapidly expand the number of landowners adopting practices that increase carbon sequestration and storage. And I think we should use that language rather than just saying rapidly expand the acreage under active forest management.
Can you just repeat what you think the better language would be? Sorry.
The number of landowners adopting practices that increase carbon sequestration and storage.
Great. Do you mind just sticking that in the chat?
Sure.
Thank you.
And the main point is,
yeah, again,
active forest management in and of itself is not always a positive.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Okay, other comments in this whole section? It's obviously a big one, this section 4. Should we break this down actually to take first the technical assistance portion, focus solely on that? Go ahead, Dana.
Well, I don't want to be preemptive. So if you want to do that first, that's fine, Jody. I'll go with your guidance here.
Were your comments on the second section, the financial incentives?
It was in the action items of technical assistance, but if you want to start and go point by point, that's fine.
No. It's, I think if you're covering the technical assistance section, go right ahead.
So as I kind of alluded to earlier, so if we're going to be splitting hairs over specificity and inclusivity, then I guess in the action items there, the last bullet on page 12 has a specific amount of money, and it also goes to a specific group in the end, and that's to licensed foresters. So I'm concerned that we're now saying, okay, we're going to put a specific amount of money in here, and it's going to go to a specific group. And we're going to be inconsistent if we're going to be quote, more inclusive in one area and less inclusive in this area. So my recommendation would be to take out the funding level and also basically just promote funding for forest professionals who can do outreach to landowners. I think it's, in my opinion, it's contradictory to or hypocritical to say we can't be we have to be more inclusive in one area and not in another.
Yeah, sorry, I was just taking notes on what you said. Barry, go ahead. Thank you, Dana.
Yeah, it's that's a little bit apples and oranges for foresters in Maine. All foresters that practice forestry and charge for their services need to be licensed by the state. 100% of foresters need to do that. And there's training programs and education and internship that people need to go through. So no one can write a management plan and get paid for it unless they have a license by the state. So that's just kind of that system. So anyone who claims to be a forester and doesn't have a state license is actually practicing illegally.
Thank you, Tom Doak.
I think this makes the, I mean, I think there's a very, I agree with Barry, and I also say that I think it's a very different situation than we talked about earlier, because we're not saying, we're saying any forester is eligible, potentially eligible. We're not saying you have to be a member of a certain group in order to be eligible. It's any forester. And our argument, my argument was any logger should be eligible, just like any forester should be eligible. So I think it's very, very different. And remember, the money largely goes to the landowner. It goes to the landowner. The landowner pays, for half the cost here. So this isn't like a subsidy to the forester. This is to subsidize the landowner who can get some of the work done.
Other perspectives on this item, but Patty, go ahead.
Yeah, Tom just said it, but I just wanted to emphasize that this is incentives for a landowner to get a management plan. And then there's a licensed forester is required to do that. So I agree with Barry. It's a little different analogy or comparison.
If some of you could also speak to the point that Dana made about identifying a specific dollar amount and whether that feels appropriate to all of you or not. Dana, go ahead.
This is probably a question. So can you also be an ecologist or a biologist and also benefit from that funding from that program? That's more of a question. And if so, then I would advocate to you can potentially put a funding level in there, but take the direction of who it goes to. And if I'm wrong, somebody correct me.
Perspectives from others? Tom, go ahead.
At least the NRCS programs, you just have to be Patty, I'm looking at you to make sure I get it right, or Barry, but technical service provider, right? So if you qualify as a technical service provider, you could provide cost share services, right? Now, if you're writing a management plan in the state of Maine, you have to be a forester, right? But there might be some other practices. You could implement some practices and be a TSP and not be a forester, I think, right?
Yeah, you can. And with NRCS, that they do have a cost share program for wildlife management plans too. And you have to be on their TSP list as a wildlife biologist to do that. But in order to get on their list as a TSP, I think you still have to have the education and whatever, like to be a TSP as a forester, you basically have to have a license. So yeah, anybody can write a plan and charge anybody for it, but it's, like, again, it's a forest management plan. You need to have a license if you're charging for forestry services. So.
Okay, so I think if I'm understanding, Patty, go ahead.
Yeah, just that it depends on the practice. So if it's a forest management plan, a licensed forester needs to be a TSP to do that plan. But as Barry said, there's other plans that you don't need to be a licensed forester and you can be a TSP on.
Could I get the rest of the group's feedback on the dollar issue? Do you all like that there's a specific dollar figure in here or not? Karen.
Yeah, I think I certainly defer to Patty and Don and the administration and those who work with this for that sort of range. And I guess the point I'd like to say is that if we can be as precise as possible, I think it's more helpful to everyone down the road. The recommendations, but the more that they get watered down and diluted and sort of generalized, I think it's harder to move to action. So whenever possible, I would encourage specificity, with the understanding and caveat language if we need it to sort of emphasize that it's not exclusive.
Thank you. Any other comments on, I think I'm hearing no objection to keeping that dollar item in there. I think that I've heard, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, that given that this bullet specifically talks about the Woods Wise program, that a requirement of the Woods Wise program is that you engage a licensed forester. Is that, do I have that correct? So, okay. All right. So I'm not seeing a way to modify this that would satisfy the majority of the group. Let's move on then. Any other items from the technical assistance portion of section 4? If not, we can move on to the financial incentives section, which starts on page 13. Okay, then let's move on to that section. There were some changes to clarify some of A through J, and I won't go through them because I don't remember all the changes that I made, but any concerns at all about that section? Barry, go ahead. And then Tom, sorry.
It's actually before that section on page 13, under financial incentives, the second bullet point, it says, create a team of agency personnel and or volunteers to interview external entities, et cetera, et cetera. I think that is really crucial. I think, this is a huge plate full of good ideas and projects that we need to be working on. And I think it's frankly more than the Forest Service just themselves can do. And I like the idea of, another task force or some kind of support group for the Maine Forest Service as they go through this and dealing with, various carbon companies and that sort of thing, that to have, kind of broaden the perspective and the workload for the Maine Forest Service. So I would take out the / or just say agency personnel and volunteers. And I just think that that's a really important concept to the success of this whole project, is not just making it this great list of ideas and then just dumping it on the Forest Service. I think keeping a broader engagement of, some of the people on this committee and other people that aren't on the committee, finding a good group to carry this torch forward is a great idea.
I see. Thank you. Tom, Dope.
So I'm still a little confused by the language here, and if I'm confused, I'm thinking that others might be when they read this. So the first paragraph under financial incentives, the first two paragraphs, two sentences, talk about all the other things going on and how rapidly it's evolving and everything, and then we shift to, okay, well, the best thing for the state of Maine is go administer this program specifically for Maine. And I'm a little confused on what we're actually, I guess I'm not saying yay or nay, I'm trying to figure out what it says. So whether it says we want a Maine specific program, or we want a program that is supportive of other efforts to help qualify landowners, to meet these evolving systems, I guess. And that, to me, that it says two different things, and I'm still I think we need to be more explicit what we're saying here, that's all. Well, I'm confused, but of what it says, I guess is what I'm saying.
Other reactions to that? Mark, go ahead.
I hadn't fully set my thoughts in a particular direction on this one, but I had a similar hesitation that there's an element of sort of a lack of clarity in saying there are lots of options emerging, therefore we should create a partnership with one.
One or more.
Right.
Right.
But, do we also want to be in the more general role of helping landowners access available options? I think is part of what Tom was asking. So we could have an active partnership to advance certain strategies, and the Forest Service could be in the role of helping landowners access information and other options.
Alec, go ahead.
So I don't see what's proposed here as being contradictory to what either Mark or Tom have said, is that we can explore how to do this most effectively. And that may involve working with one or more, as you correctly point out, Jody, existing programs, or it could be in the end saying, hey, there are some better ideas out here, and we want to add to the types of programs that are available to Maine landowners, and we're going to head down this path. This allows for us to explore all of those options and figure out what we feel is going to be most effective in reaching the broadest suite of Maine landowners with a program that they want to participate in.
Is there specific, so I see a hand clapping from Ivan. Is there, Adam jumped out. Here we go, bring him back in. Is there, okay, go ahead, Karen, and then Tom.
So, just to retrace our steps getting to this, 2 meetings ago, the group had talked about having Maine issue an RFP. A subgroup of us met with administration representatives and devised this approach, which is much more flexible. And I think the critical concept here, which I think is stated pretty clearly, is that based on the fact that there is sort of not a stable universe out there yet of voluntary carbon programs, that rather than wait 2 or 3 years to see which ones make it through the trial period and model period, that the state engage in a discussion now to find 1 or more partners. From the very first meeting of this group, it's been understood that the state Forest Service would be in a role of connecting landowners to information and programs. So this is in addition to that. And I guess I think it's quite clear that what we're trying to do here is react to an evolving market, an evolving world, but not stand still and not wait and not sit back with our arms crossed and say, well, let's just see what happens in a few years. This is Maine leading by being actively engaged and helping figure out what's best for our landowners.
You. We have Tom, no, sorry. Yeah, Tom and then Ivan.
The way Alec described it is not what I see here, because, and I can agree with the way Alec described it, but the language says would be best served in working with a partnership with an external entity to jointly develop and administer. If we want to look at how best to engage the landowners, if that's part of the recommendation, I'm fine with that. But we're also proposing to hire a carbon specialist who I think would be in contact with all the possibilities. If the Forest Service wants to spend time, how best to engage landowners, whether it's helping them get into one of the systems or possibly looking at its own system, I guess I don't have any objection to it. I don't think that that's necessarily the best use of time, but this kind of talks about we're going to hire somebody on the outside and they're going to develop their own program. That's been that's the confusion, and I believe this is exact. I believe I brought this up at the last meeting. My same comment is, I'm confused about what we're asking folks to do here. So I would ask for clarity.
Before I take Ivan, what if, and maybe this is just wiggle language, but at least it doesn't state it so definitively. What about the existence of this dynamic environment suggests that the state of Maine may be well served rather than would be best served? Just think on that while I take Ivan.
I think you just addressed my comment. I picked the wrong hand. I applaud Alec, but I wasn't intending to clap. Alec uses the word explore, but I kind of agree with Tom. This sounds like it's saying these other programs exist and it mandates. It says the entity will develop and administer, et cetera, et cetera. I read it as this is going to be developed or this is going to be explored, and it has to happen based on the inferred language as compared to entering a relationship with this partner and exploring it. So it may happen. I think your change, Jody, or something similar would solve that. I agree with the intent of what's here. I don't think the language is clear enough.
So Mark, and sorry, I don't know which one of you raised your hand first. Mark.
Let Mark go.
Okay. I had a comment on this section, but not specifically on this point. I think we've shifted the emphasis in an appropriate way up top. My other comment was on G in the long list of things the Maine Forest Service could, for example, work with the partner to do. G is in bold, highlighting it presumably as sort of the key item on this list. I have mixed feelings about that, but I would say that if we want to keep that emphasis, it should be only the first sentence of G that would be in bold. The rest of it is sort of more speculative, starting with this could include, might also include, might also include. That stuff to me doesn't belong called out in bold, getting the emphasis.
Got it. Thank you. Patty and then Barry.
Thank you, Jody. Just going on the confusion, I've been a little confused of developing a program. So if it means, you know, education outreach, providing options of existing programs, which is very fluid right now. There's a lot going on with it. Forest Service is a good fit for that, where we could be a good clearinghouse of information of this fluid development of the programs. If it means developing and administering a voluntary carbon program, I don't really think it's the role of a state agency to do that. You know, so I like the language of explore and research and move towards working with stakeholders and looking at all the systems and educating on those programs.
Barry.
Okay, so what we're talking about now is kind of the core of the whole the RFP proposal that our group had worked on a lot. And I don't think we should take out the wording wherever it was. It said would be best served and change that to maybe best served. I think we should keep the would in there. I think Patty just said very clearly that the Maine Forest Service is great for the outreach and connecting people with resources and that sort of thing. But I think if we're really going to change things, we need to have more than just a clearinghouse, you know, handing a list of landowners a list of climate carbon companies and telling them to go figure it out. I think the opportunity is here, and the whole idea is for the state of Maine to partner with a company, a business who would have the inspiration to come up with some new ideas to get these practices on the ground, get more landowners engaged, and they would have a financial incentive to do this because it would be good for their business. It could be a model that could be used in other states as well. So I think that we need to keep this proposal as kind of first and foremost as part of our report here.
So
I don't think we ought to water it down. And
There-
I think there's definitely a role and, you know, again, the role of whatever task force or support committee or whatever you want to call it for the Forest Service, going through and engaging with these companies is going to be really pretty crucial if we want to actually get something done.
There's 2 points being made here. I just want to sort of separate them out. One is, are we kind of, do we have a directive, a strict directive to develop a program, or do we acknowledge that we don't know what we don't know, and we think it could be helpful to the state to develop one? So I was mostly hearing support for this concept about that it may well serve the state to work in partnership with an external entity to jointly develop this. That's one issue. The second issue is that if a program is developed, you know, I think what I'm hearing the Maine Forest Service say is, you don't think you should be in that role to potentially administer a program or work in partnership with an external entity to administer that program. And I think we need to be super clear about this point, because that is a central component of this draft. I was hearing up to this point that that was something that the group was wanting to move ahead on. Karen, was your hand raised?
Yeah, I think I'd like to have this stay relatively unchanged as a directive to try. You know, that's all I'm hoping that the state will try this, you know, what's listed here on page 14 and the run up on page 13. You know, whether it's the Maine Forest Service that sort of hosts that effort, or the Office of Innovation, you know, to me, it makes sense for the Maine Forest Service to be involved in that. But I think I've felt that for some time now, we've all agreed that the Maine Forest Service would not actually lead the program, that, or you know, that it would be with a cooperating entity or entities. And that's been very clear as well, that it would not necessarily be just one. But I think I would feel a great sense of sort of wasted effort if we didn't have a clear directive for the appropriate entity and state government to try to explore these. Because I think, Barry, you've said it quite well, that just being a clearinghouse isn't going to really get us to where we want to be. So what that effort looks like, I think there's guidance here, the kinds of things that exploration would address. It's very clear. And, you know, if we don't try, nothing's going to happen. So that's just what I wanted to emphasize, the importance of this effort, and that it be clear that we want an effort to do this.
Thank you, Karen. Before I take Tom and then Patty, I just want to maybe have you all consider the first bullet under the task force recommends that the Maine Forest Service : it says develop a program, and maybe that might be language that could be modified to make it clearer what we're talking about, that this is not on the back of the Maine Forest Service to, you know, and I understand later on it talks about working in partnership, but the leading bullet sort of says it's going to be the Maine Forest Service that does this, and maybe that is the sticking point here. Tom and then Patty.
Thanks, Jody. I'm trying to understand what's being suggested. So as an example, and I'll take any company, say, is the idea that we would say Finite Carbon comes forward and says, okay, I'll work with you, that we'd ask Finite Carbon to develop a program specific for landowners in Maine? Is that what this is doing? I'm asking because I'm asking for some clarification. Is that the kind of thing people envision?
My understanding is that that is what could happen here. It could be not that Finite Carbon comes and says, we've got a great program. We know that already. We know that Finite Carbon has a program. But it could be that an entity like Finite Carbon comes to Maine and says, we can tailor a program to Maine and we can work in partnership with you because we've got X expertise. We can work with you to design a program specific to Maine.
So Finite Carbon would run it and be responsible for it and implement it and.
To be determined, That's
So that's the vision of what we would be doing. I mean, that's my question, I guess.
That is my understanding. Is that the rest of the group's understanding as to how this is worded? That it could be such. It could be what you've described, but all of the details to be determined in terms of who does what, how much responsibility Maine Forest Service has, how much responsibility Finite Carbon has. If the rest of you had a different impression of what this says, please weigh in. Let me take Patty in the interim.
Thanks. Just going back to what you just said a second ago, Jody, and that task force recommends the Maine Forest Service develop a program. So I'm just saying again, my confusion of what does that mean, develop a program? Is it outreach? Is it, and it gets to the crux of what everyone's saying, is it partnering with another organization? And we had agreed before that this, number one, there's a carbon position that's being proposed, right? So a carbon specialist, if you will, this would be something that that person could explore. Again, that's that explore, and leaving options open and not tying ourselves down to, I do have objections to saying that we will develop a carbon program until I know exactly what program is defined as here. But I don't think our hands should be tied, and that we should become a competitive program with other programs.
Barry and then Alec, unless I saw your hands up in the wrong order. May I take Alec first, just because we haven't heard you weigh in on this yet?
Okay, I agree with your characterization of what is intended here. It's to explore without all of the details being determined a priori. I agree with Karen's statement that if we don't say, look, let's try this, let's explore this, let's see if this can work, then we're going to diminish the impact of this entire effort. And as regards, what would be done, if you look at page 14, A through, and then continuing over onto page 15, J, we've tried to lay out the steps that would seem logical to be undertaken to implement this. And if you look through the language in there, you see repeatedly, could be, explore ideas, could, for example, are possible, could result in, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end, we say, the possible approach articulated in A through J above is intended as initial guidance only. In other words, let's get on with it, explore what could be done, figure out what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And if we come up with good ideas for how we can advance the whole cause of sequestering and storing more carbon in Maine forest while maintaining harvest on small land ownerships, then let's get on with it and do it. But we need to explore all of those ideas before we know the answer to that question. So is there uncertainty as to where we might end up at the end of the road? Yeah, this isn't building a two-car garage. This is exploring a complicated option.
May I suggest a possible solution that would enable us to go on break? And let me take Melissa right after this, is that first bullet, instead of saying develop a program, say explore the development of a program. Because what you're wanting to, just hear me out, Barry, what you are what you're committing to, what I'm hearing your group wanting to do is take the next step. Like, couldn't we at least take the next step to solicit input from a variety of external entities to hear their good ideas without committing to something that you don't know what they're going to say. So it would seem to me that there would be a reason to be comfortable with exploring the development of by doing these things that are recommended below. And then you're not committing to a program that you don't know the details of yet. As you consider that, Melissa, go ahead.
Just building off of that, what if it read, develop strategies to enable small woodland owners? It's not a program, but they're involved and they're looking for ways to make, collaborations work. Just a simple change there.
What are the wishes of the group? Dana, go right ahead.
Yeah.
And then Barry.
So I've been pretty consistent that I'm not in favor of the state creating or administering a program. So here's a suggestion. So in the first, and I can send this in the chat. So in the first paragraph under financial incentives, that bolded section could just be, a couple of things could be changed there so that after the word partnership, which appears, if everybody's following along, partnership with external entities. So we're not saying a specific entity, but with external entities, because I think this needs to be in the private sector, having multiple. So the state would work in partnership with external entities to develop a voluntary credit-based and/or practice-oriented, and I wouldn't change anything else. Then I would get rid of the entire next section that says the task force recommends that the Maine Forest Service, because that to me says the Forest Service is going to do X, Y, and Z. And then I would keep where it begins on page 14. In this regard, the Maine Forest Service could, for example, work with the partners selected to, and I would keep the rest of that section. That gets rid of, to me, the specificity that the Forest Service is going to do something, but it also says the Forest Service is going to work with any entity in the private sector that wants to create a market-based approach. That's what I would recommend.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Barry, go ahead.
Okay, so I would respectfully disagree with taking out that whole section. That's just like a huge gash in the middle of this whole concept. And I also am not in favor of changing under the task force recommends the Maine Forest Service. You suggested the word explore as opposed to develop, and explore to me is just kind of a wishy-washy word. It doesn't really mean anything. I mean, we're exploring by what we're doing right now. It's not really an action word.
Barry, where did I say explore?
No, I did.
No, you,
Oh,
Jody did.
I
You did.
apologize.
Yeah, Jody
I'm
did.
sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, I mean, it seems like this whole concept is getting a little bit of a slash and burn happening right now at the very last minute, which is, I have to admit, is a bit alarming to me, because I think it's kind of the essence of what we're doing. And I can understand the Maine Forest Service's hesitancy to sign up for something you don't know what it is. But I see the partnership thing is really important here. I see the Maine woodland owners as an important partner in all this. Maybe as kind of an example, maybe Finite Carbon comes forward and says, we're really good at doing this on large land ownerships and dealing with carbon credits and that sort of thing. We want to reach small landowners, but we're not quite sure how to do that. And the Maine Forest Service says, well, we have experience and the image to be able to do that. We're working closely with the Maine Woodland Owners Association. They're working on the same goals. Let's see if we can put our minds together and come up with a program that will work for everyone. Finite Carbon has the financial incentive to work on this because for them as a business, it could be a big moneymaker and reach a lot of acres they're not otherwise reaching. It could be a benefit to the Maine Forest Service because it becomes one of the programs that they can advertise to Maine landowners as an option for them. It works for the Maine woodland owners because it's just more activity and another opportunity for the landowners that they represent. So that's, yeah, I guess I should just stop there.
Okay, let me take Ryan and then Amanda and then Alec.
Thanks. I think a few things from my perspective. I do think there is value in identifying the Maine Forest Service as the agency kind of tapped to ensure that progress is made in this regard. So I think not referencing a specific entity that can put the effort towards coordinating these volunteers and external entities, I think is a good thing. I do think the first paragraph under the task force recommends the Maine Forest Service, and or the first bullet point of developing a program might be putting the cart ahead of the horse as well. I would think that involving, you know, the volunteers and the other groups and entities to participate in the process is going to be part of that process. So I think your recommendation, Jody, to you know, I get Barry's concept of using the term explore is a little bit watered down, but I also think that we should pull, you know, these volunteers and these entities together to have this discussion before the Maine Forest Service develops the program. And I think to that point, I'd advocate that we discuss or maybe put forward the proposal that an advisory committee is established to assist the Maine Forest Service as opposed to the term volunteer. And I think that may be a good thing to have continued and ongoing assistance in terms of addressing issues or even actually implementing some of the things that might come out of that process.
Great, thank you. Amanda and then Alec and then Karen. And then I'm going to take the pulse of the group, given what time it is and the additional items that we have to cover.
Well, I was just going to share my own perspective here, which is that I mean, I think the way in which the term program is presented here, it isn't necessarily prescriptive in terms of what that means. And I think a program can be a lot of different things. A program could be, you know, a program with staff that are providing the technical assistance, doing the trainings that we talked about, making sure that we are a good clearinghouse for information, staying up to date on what is happening with carbon markets so that we can be informed and inform others. And doesn't necessarily mean that we are developing a program to administer, you know, a carbon market program or whatever. So I guess that as we've talked about this, and I feel like this feels a little bit like deja vu. I feel like we've had this conversation. I think where we ended up was that there is flexibility here for the Forest Service to determine what that looks like. And so I guess I would just leave it at that.
So you all, thank you, Amanda, and you're all seeing Patty's comment in the chat as a way out of this. What are those rooms that you can rent where you try to figure out how to get out of the locked room? I feel like that's where we're at right now. This is a possible way out of the locked room. To potentially modify the beginning of that first bullet with that language. Let me take Alec, are you still wanting? And then Karen.
Yep. Okay, so I've got a simple suggestion, and I'm sympathetic to Patty's concern about loading a big amount of work on the Maine Forest Service. I would suggest that we just say, and this mimics the language that's in the first paragraph, the task force recommends that Maine develop a program. And throughout, it's Maine. And so we're leaving the issue of how that gets done to the administration as to how that's organized for Maine to explore this stuff. I'm trying to take the monkey off of the back of the Maine Forest Service.
Thank you. Karen.
I wanted to endorse Ryan's suggestion of inserting advisory committee for volunteers. I think that's a wonderful idea and gives it a little bit more heft. Patty, I think I'm okay with your suggested language. I was actually doing a synonym search while everyone was talking for program, but I think I'm okay with what you're suggesting, Patty. But I think we, we're giving recommendations for who's going to start this. We need to name someone. And I'm hoping, and I think, and Commissioner, that it sounds like you're okay with generally being the host for the start of this. And I thank you for that.
Let me suggest that we, for this iteration of the draft, which again is going to go out for a 3-week public comment period, that we use the phrase that Patty has put into the chat to start the first bullet, that we keep the Maine Forest Service as, in that introductory line. We basically keep everything else as is, but we just modify the beginning of that bullet. If there are major objections about that, please raise your hand. And then if not, we're going to go on break. Okay. All right. So then let's go on break. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for, I think you had another commitment, Patty. Thank you for staying with us for this long. And we'll pick back up at 11 o'clock, 8 minutes from now. Comments, not just about 5, but anything else. You want to offer that to the group?
Yeah, I guess my overall impression is that there's some little fine tuning pieces that I probably will just send to you as far as little word adjustments. But as far as the big picture items, I'm satisfied.
Okay, awesome. Great. Then we've got Adam back. Who are we missing? We've got Stacy, and we've got Tom Doak. So, and do we have Amanda yet? So maybe we're missing Amanda. All right. So let's move on to section 5, which covers the bottom of the second half of page 15 and the top of 16. Any thoughts about that? And yeah. Comments? You're all happy? Thumbs up? Move on. Tom Doak.
I think there's probably the same comments we had earlier about exclusivity. I don't really want to rehash all those, to be honest with you. But I think that this probably has some of that same built into it. I know this was I supported this recommendation when it was in the earlier task force that we were on, and largely to try to get some smaller equipment available for smaller owners. But I think this is just another one of those areas we're going to have to figure out how to put in here about not the exclusivity. And I don't know if Patty's on, but I think she'd probably have that. I don't know that we ought to be directing who gets funding and what they qualify and who gets the priority as far as if you're going to finance some of this equipment. I think that's not the role of this group. I think it's up to the Forest Service to develop those standards. So I'm not sure this group should be saying these people should get it, these people shouldn't. So but I'm supportive of additional money there, and those kind of things, and what equipment actually qualifies.
Other reactions to this? Barry, you're in agreement with Tom's points? Okay, Patty?
So I apologize, I came on a little late. What?
We're on section 5 on page 15. And okay. I think Tom Doak is wondering whether the concerns around exclusivity to third-party certified harvesting companies are mirrored in this section or not. And while you think about that, do you want me to take Mark?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead, Mark.
Thanks. I was not involved with the group that put this section together, but the way I read it is.
You're muted. You just got muted for a second.
The way I read this section is, it's a recommendation to provide assistance and support to incentivize more people to gain third-party certification. I guess I don't see that as exclusive. I see that as, helping more have access to that opportunity.
Other perspectives on that? I'm going to take you, Dana, for sure, but since you essentially wrote this section, I want to make sure you get as much feedback on this as possible, in addition to me, obviously. Other comments on this section from others? Okay, Patty and then Dana.
So, yeah, I mean, this goes back to our earlier conversation. And I just want to first point out the fourth bullet, increase funding for the direct link program for greater availability of loans for logging equipment. So, small landowners are using many different loggers, and I just go back to that fairness, equitable, and accessible. That this program, I believe we need to look at reassessing this program and see assess what equipment would affect the carbon issue, and go from there. So again, would rather it be inclusive and accessible to many different levels of logging contractors.
Thank you. Dana, go ahead.
Sure. So I appreciate Mark's comments before. So I do want to just point out to everybody, I don't know what is exclusive here. It talks about third-party certified contractors. So there's no program mentioned from the private sector. Anyone can create a third-party certification program. So I just want to make sure that's clear. That's one. And I do want to point out, there's obviously from this group, and I respect it and I understand it and I'm in support of it. On the one hand, we want to make sure that forestry is practiced by a licensed, credentialed individual as a licensed forester. So that provides credibility. And there's obviously many reasons the licensure system exists. And I'm in no way, shape, or form do my comments mean that it's not respected and shouldn't be there. It should be, absolutely. But at the same token, why wouldn't we want the same credibility from the logging community so that there's actually a verification process that exists for accountability purposes? I guess I'm at a loss as to why folks, one, say there's specificity and we're not being inclusive, because there's nothing here that says that any third-party certification program couldn't be used. It doesn't specify one. And then two, we should have accountability, just like there's accountability for a licensure system for the forestry community. Shouldn't the logging community have the same thing when we're advocating for a carbon-based program for landowners? That's our perspective. And, I'm the only one, I think, on this group that represents the logging community. So obviously I have a stake in this, but that's my perspective. So again, I go back to what I made for comments before. If we're going to advocate one, we should advocate for both. And it shouldn't be, on the one hand, we're okay on this side, but we're not okay on the other side. It appears that we're trying to water things down.
Any reactions to Dana's point? Barry, go ahead.
The professional logging contractors is really the only third-party certification program available for loggers now in Maine. There is CLP. I guess it's not what you would call third party. So I know when PLC got started, there was a lot of loggers that became members of it, and rightly so. And it was free for them at the time. And then things changed and a lot of loggers dropped out of the program because it just got a lot more costly. So there are a lot of good loggers out there who, for whatever a myriad of reasons, aren't third party certified. And they still do really good work. Some of them are former PLC members, some aren't. So those are the people that I would hate to exclude from anything, you know, involved with it, with this project here. And loggers have so many pressures on them and, you know, it's increasing all the time. I don't want to go through the whole list now, but, you know, having having to go, in addition to everything else they have to do to run their business and make a living, having to go through the cost and time involved in a third-party certification process is sometimes just not something that they want to do. And, you know, you have to respect that as a business decision. And that doesn't mean they're a bad logger. It just means that there's so much going on for them that that's not something they've prioritized. And I think, you know, getting back to the inclusivity thing, that those are some of the people we don't want to exclude by this process.
Thank you. Dana and then Tom.
I just want to correct something, Barry, that you said. So I think the program you're referring to is the Master Logger Program. So one, that's not run by the PLC. I just want everyone to be clear.
No.
Our organization does not run that program. Two, so that's run by an independent organization now that is in 7 Northeast states. The Master Logger Program that you're referring to, again, doesn't have to be the only third-party certification program. There certainly could be any third-party certification program could be created. But the one that you're referring to is now in 20 states in the United States. It's in 7 foreign countries. So it's very expansive. It's now been adopted by FSC, SFI, and the American Tree Farm. So I just want to be clear that there are statements that are being made here that aren't necessarily completely factual. So I just want to correct that for the record.
Okay.
Thanks.
I stand corrected.
Thank you. Tom.
Well, I agree with basically all of Barry's comments. I would say, you know, there's a lot of landowners that we're not asking landowners to be certified and only work with certified landowners. I mean, and I'm not sure this is a huge issue. I'm not sure that the logging that goes on now and the equipment that's being used is causing a major issue on the climate side. If it is, we should know that, but I'm not hearing that from folks. But if we're going to get equipment, if we want low impact harvesting equipment, are we going to focus on, I mean, this group is supposed to work with the small landowners. Are we then suggesting we're going to use these on only those that are working on small owners should get, you know, or should they be prioritized, or those people that don't have this equipment already, those kind of things. I don't think that's our job. I think we're supporting increased dollars for the program. And I think let the Forest Service figure out the best way. And then a bullet you've not talked about is the cost share. On cost share programs, the landowner is if you get, my suggestion would be like the earlier one, anybody can be a TSP, technical service provider. And it doesn't have to be a logger, it doesn't have to be a forester, anybody. So any of those activities on that last bullet on, I guess the first bullet on 16, anybody could do those if they qualify. And I think that should be but remember the landowners end up with the obligation, and to qualify for these, the landowner has to agree to maintain them over often a 10-year period. So the reason the money's going to the landowners, they also have the obligation to maintain them. So it doesn't go to the forester, it doesn't go to a logger, it doesn't go to the contractor. It goes to the landowner, and the landowner agrees to maintain the practice. So I don't think you want to subsidize the contractor. You've got to subsidize the landowner, who then obligates themselves to maintain the practice. Otherwise, you could have you could have things just kind of disappear. So,
Thank you. Tom Abello.
Thanks. Yeah, I hear what Tom is saying, what Barry is saying. I think we do need some language in there around loggers and encouraging better practices on the ground. I mean, that was something that was in the Natural Working Lands discussion. We've talked about it here. Because so many landowners don't get a management plan, they go directly to a logger. We want to make sure that there's something there, some education, some outreach, some kind of incentive, so that the job on the ground, the product on the ground is still meeting high standards. So I don't know the right way to adjust some of the language that Tom and Barry have flagged, but I do think this section needs to stay in here in some way.
So what I'm hearing overall, and I'm paying attention to the time, and we do need to move on. We've got multiple additional sections here. What I'm hearing is support for the concept of increasing funding that loggers would have available to them to purchase low ground pressure equipment. What I think is the sticking point here is the third-party certification. And I just can't ignore that. I fully appreciate your perspective, Dana, but everything that I'm hearing from other people is they're getting hung up on that be the requirement for having access to, being, prioritized. And so I don't really see any other way around redrafting this for public comment that removes that specificity while still ensuring that all of these options are available to loggers. If there is, I know that you're going to disagree with that, Dana. I guess I need to hear whether there are others who disagree with that, or if I am hearing correctly what the overarching sentiment is of the group so that we can move on. Mark, and then sorry, Tom, but let me just, were you going to raise a totally different issue, Tom, or
No.
Okay, please, then Tom and then Mark.
I would suggest, one way to do it, and we talked earlier about those people that are trained to the climate friendly practices, and I would say, I have no issue recommending that those have gone through some kind of process by which they've been exposed to, here's what we're talking about climate friendly practices, because most of the certification programs have not even addressed all these climate friendly practices, whether it's land certification or a lot, this is all new. So for example, SFI is working right now on implementing a climate friendly carbon standard, but even the land certifications haven't fully engaged in, the review of those systems. So I'd say if you met this training standard, then maybe that's a qualification for receiving these funds.
Okay.
And as a way to keep something in there to differentiate between certain types of loggers, because then it's open to anybody who wants to do it, and it doesn't cost anything. You got to go to the training.
Mark, and then I'm going to suggest that we move on to additional topics.
I was going to suggest that there's, I think, some middle ground here. The first bullet is already talking about it's fully inclusive in terms of technical assistance and training. Mm-hmm. The second bullet is promoting voluntary use of third-party certified harvesting. There's no specific funding tied to that. I think we could keep that language. The third bullet is financial cost share for harvesting companies to become third-party certified. Again, I think that's a reasonable option to offer to contractors. The fourth bullet is direct link, increasing funding for that. I don't see that as tied to third-party certification. I don't think it needs to be.
Just to clarify, you think that as well for the last sentence of that bullet?
Yeah, I don't think it needs to be in that case. I think the direct link program doesn't necessarily have to be tied to third party.
So you're suggesting that change?
Yep. The fifth bullet, again, I think wouldn't have to be tied to third party. So I think we could keep the third party reference in the second and third bullets, where we're supporting it and we're providing cost share resources for companies to achieve it. But when we talk about general training resources and other resources, that those would not have to be limited to third-party certified contractors.
Thank you. Before I take your comment, Dana, and it's going to be the last one, could I see a thumbs up for anybody who agrees with what Mark said? Okay, then do I need to take your comment, Dana? Can we move on?
No, we can move on.
Okay, let's move on. You're okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mark. Great. Section 6. I don't think we made any, I made any changes other than try to rephrase that first paragraph, realizing that this is sort of a work in progress and that we're trying to get feedback at the very same time from MMA. So it's worded in, the structure is a little awkward in light of that, but the content, I don't think it changed. Any additional comments on this section? Okay, well, no. Oh, I'm sorry. Was I wrong about that? There was a clarification on this page 18 on the non-forested land piece, I think, after the meeting. And that was the result of conversations between Mark and Amanda and how to tackle that issue. So barring any concerns about that, we'll move on. Okay. I know that Patrick had hoped to provide additional language to me as a recommendation to add to number 7, and you saw his email this morning. He sounds a little busy. And so I added this language to make reference to the forest carbon for commercial landowners program. Any concerns about this section? Okay. And then I did not make changes to section 8.
All right, Jody, I don't have any concerns about that section. I would just add that there are other conversations going on as well. I know you're not trying to be inclusive of all that's going on in that space, but that's just one opportunity for conversations around what's happening with sort of larger landowners.
Okay, I'll say, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, great. Pass over 8 or need to focus on that section at all on page 19? Okay, then let's, do you want an opportunity, Adam? Would it be helpful for you to kind of give a high level summary of how did you land here? I think it could be helpful to the group that those members who weren't part of the subgroup.
Okay, so I was not here on August 6th for the meeting, but from what I understand, it was a robust discussion about how do you define a target? Do you deal with acres? Where are we, who do you include? Who do you exclude? So the subgroup met, I think, the following Monday to take all those comments into account and sort of basically discuss more about sort of this preliminary analysis that we did, the knowledge, with the supreme help of Logan, and sort of the knowledge of what we really have about where currently things stand on the ground with respect to small landowners and how much you can move the needle under specific practices. I think overall the group agreed that, one, it's really hard to differentiate between a small and a large landowner when then you're coming up to aggregating across the whole state of Maine, sort of what we can do to sort of really overall increase or maintain, or however you want to measure, forest carbon, right? Maybe in the future, there'll be better ways to use data and things to inform that. But I think even the exercise that we discussed earlier about really even having uncertainty about how many landowners and acres and stuff fall into certain bins makes it hard to come up with like a specific number or specific acres. So we just noted a lot of uncertainty around that and said, okay, then what can we do to come up with a numeric goal? Mark Berry sort of pitched this, and I know he's raised it in the past, but said, well, if we're concerned about both wood products and about sequestration and growing stock, why don't we? And we're interested in basically helping to achieve this net zero goal in Maine by 2045, which is, again, it's a statewide initiative. Why don't we bring all those things together into one sort of target number that we can look at over the over the entire state and that look at the forest sector as a whole. So from there, that's where we came up with and basically looked at sort of estimates that sort of historically how it's looked and where we are right now. And Maine right now is roughly at 12 million metric tons of both forest carbon being sequestered in our forest ecosystem. So that's what you're seeing actually out there on the ground happening, plus an additional about 3 million tons per year being stored in harvested wood products. And so we came up with, Maine is at a historical high point, at least over the last 30 years. So we said, and if we continue to be anywhere near where we are today, and greenhouse gases continue to fall as planned under other legislation in terms of meeting the 80% below 2050 levels and the gross greenhouse gas emissions, that forests will more than do its fair share to help meet that net zero carbon neutrality goal. And so that's how we sort of converge to that. Again, acknowledging that year on year, right, we're dealing with a natural ecosystem that can have variation and fluxes and stuff. So we also said, let's not try to have this be specific that it has to be 12 million metric tons year on year, but let's look over sort of a 5-year average, acknowledging that there are going to be these various fluxes that could happen due to natural disturbances and things like that, but also acknowledge the contribution that harvested wood products can play in all this, which should help to sort of achieve our dual goal of, maintaining or enhancing harvests, but also maintaining or enhancing carbon sequestration as well.
Thank you. Great summary. Anybody else? Could anybody who's observing the meeting go mute themselves if you're not muted? Just hopefully that gets rid of an echo. Is there anyone else on that subgroup that would like to add anything to what Adam said? Comments from the rest of the group about this recommendation? Tom, go ahead. And then Karen.
Yeah, I was on the group. I think I agree completely with this. I think some wording could make it clear exactly what we're saying here. It's a little, Adam, it's just a little technical or something. I think, I think what we're saying is the combined role of forests and forest products, if we can keep that at the current, and this is my simple way, at the current level, we will have achieved incredible benefit here, that right on a 5-year average. If we can keep that, then this would be really good shape, because we're going to lose some acres, but hopefully we can make up for it and things like that. Is that so? Some language that makes it clearer, I think, would be helpful in here.
Okay. Other,
I guess I would add, it sounds minimalistic, but it really isn't. And when you look at the role of the forest, I mean, I know people want to say, well, we ought to increase it by 50% or something, but we're at an incredible amount already. And I don't think this is a minimalistic goal, frankly.
Karen, I think you were next.
I have a specific point on the issue of voided forest loss. So I can wait if it's more on the discussion is more on the goals.
Then Barry, thank you. Barry?
I have a question on the goals, kind of a follow-up. So basically now we're sequestering those 12 million, et cetera, per year. That's kind of our status quo, and that's good. But then that's on page 19. On page 20, that we're saying the target is basically at least keeping up with what we're doing, the 12 million tons. So I was a little confused, because I thought we were actually going to, with this whole process, be trying to increase and do more than the status quo. Like on page 29, the bottom page 29 says, the estimate is that if all Maine's forest landowners participate in a forest carbon sequestration program, about 4 million additional tons could be accrued annually. So I guess that would be in addition to the 12. So that's like the reach goal, and 12 is the minimum. So it seems like we ought to set our target for more than what we're already doing. not necessarily the full reach of another 4 million tons, but someplace
So,
more than what we're just doing. Or am I misreading it?
right, so at the risk of, again, getting technical, where we are now is at 12. We do not know where that baseline is going to be in 5 years. We could be less than that, right? And so the idea behind that is that, if you look at the trajectory in figure 1, we're at a high point, right? So the point is that it could take some effort to maintain at that high point of where we are. So the best way to do it is look at the purple line and then flip it over, right? Ideally, you want that purple line to be as low as possible because that's the sequestration that's happening year on year. And for some points that are buried in there, there's uncertainty about where we're going to be. And I think just if we can, and the group agreed that just if we can even maintain where we are, as Tom noted, that's actually going to be really good overall for Maine's forest because it's still going to be historically high, right? And I'm just not 100% certain without more data and more projections to show where we might be in the future, that 4 million in addition to the baseline, well, that baseline could actually be going down, right? So we have to acknowledge what that means, right? And it doesn't mean 4 million in addition to where we are at 12 million. It just means in addition to some baseline practice. And so that baseline practice might mean that our forests are just naturally at a pretty fast growing state. And if we continue with that, they're not going to continue to grow at that same rate.
So can you explain why the baseline would go down?
Well, as trees get older and mature and stands get overstocked, it comes back to they don't grow as fast year on year. So if they don't grow as fast year on year, the sequestration number is going to go down, even if, right? So this is you might have more stock on the landscape, but the change from year to year to get to that more stock, the number to get that greater stock is going to decline because as the trees get older, mature, more crowded, et cetera, it could potentially be there, right? So.
If you all end up being comfortable with this goal, I don't know if you will, but if you did, I see the point that it is a difficult point to convey that by maintaining the status quo is ambitious. I think that it could be easy for a layperson to read this plan and say, oh my God, they just worked on this for 6 months and they're not proposing to do anything. So, and obviously that's not the case, but I think that some help with some additional wording around this, Adam, I think is important. Not just for marketing messaging, that's not my point. It's really to make sure that the public understands the challenges that we're under to maintain the current level and the threats to that and how it would be a positive outcome to maintain the status quo if that's where you all land. But I don't know if you do. Mark.
I wanted to thank Barry for asking that question and for pushing us to see if we are being appropriately ambitious. I think it's a really important question. As Adam explained, the few of us that were working on this, first, we were coming from a place where at the last meeting, we didn't have a goal. We were only talking about the adoption of practices, and we were not talking about a statewide carbon goal. So it seemed important to get a goal into our recommendations, at least to me. And, we were working with Pat and his concerns around how that goal would be perceived from the other perspective. But I do think that a goal for maintaining the annual sequestration in the forest and forest products where it has been recently is a really important one and is a really meaningful one. And while I could support, a more ambitious goal, I think if we can keep our forests showing net annual sequestration at the current levels for the next 25 years, that would be a fantastic thing for the climate. And it would put the state on a trajectory to far exceed its net neutrality goal. And so, we want to be reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with the state's goals. And if we do that and we do this, we come out way ahead. And I think it provides us with an important talking point about the importance of our forests to the climate and to those statewide ambitions that can help in the challenging conversations that we will have going forward, as there are a lot of pressures on our forests. And we know that we will see some loss of forest acreage, over those 25 years as well.
Thank you. Karen, or did I miss somebody else? Karen, go ahead.
This is a very helpful discussion, and looking at some of the bolded language on page 20, it appears that this goal would be reevaluated. Just maybe who's going to do that, and what would be a kind of a criteria parameter for reevaluating it? That be Adam in sort of permanent employment?
Well,
I hope to train somebody else to do this the next time around, right? That's the joke, is the next task force is the next generation. Yeah, I mean, we put that in, and this is my way of saying we're trying really hard to figure out how to give a more definitive answer. As we all know, forest measurements are hard, data is hard, right? All this stuff. And so it's the idea is that if more information comes and there's new ways to measure this and we have better levels of accuracy. Or the other concern was like if spruce budworm comes back or something like that, right? And we're totally on a different trajectory, then we might have to revisit. Who exactly is in charge of reconvening that? We didn't really have a discussion around that. It was more about this caveat that there's always uncertainties, right? And we want to be ambitious, but again, we have to acknowledge that there could be ways that we adjust in either direction as new information or things come about.
Before I take Alec, let me just suggest that one option would be to task the advisory committee that you've spoken about earlier as playing a role in the development or the exploration of the financial incentives related piece of section 4. You could task that same advisory committee to be the entity that reevaluates the target at the 5-year mark. Just something to think about. Alec, go ahead.
So I apologize for not having thought about this before, but this is a place where the distinction between sequestration rates, which is what you add on an annual basis, and storage is important. And I haven't really given a lot of thought in this context to what a goal for increased storage in Maine's forests is, but that would be another important dimension to this, and I would have to think about it. So for instance, increasing from X number of cords or tons of carbon or whatever per acre to a higher target of storage where you're taking the sequestration and you're adding it to storage.
Ivan?
So Alec, wouldn't that would be incorporated into the sequestration calculation? It doesn't matter where it is, it's the sequestration is the amount that's being removed from the atmosphere that the atmosphere sees on an annual basis, distributed between the land and products.
Yeah, okay, well, again, I hadn't really thought about this distinction between storage and what we're taking out every year. So
yeah, no, it is an important distinction. I just don't think it relates to this point as far as this target.
All right.
Okay, so we're at 11:40, which is when we talked about seeking public comment. I'd like to pivot to that, but I just want to, and Karen, I see you, hold on just one sec. I just want to sort of end this with, are there any major concerns that this group has to having this be the figure that goes out for public comment, notwithstanding potentially adding some additional language to explain it a little bit more clearly. Karen and then Tom, and then we'll take public comment.
Well, my point that I kind of put on hold back a ways was I thought that the recommended amount of conservation of forest land seemed awfully low to me.
Where is this? Where is this?
It's
I don't remember listing. For conservation of forest.
avoided forest conversion.
What page?
I'm looking at page 24, and I think it's somewhere else too. But it somewhere, I think it showed, on page 27, maximum number of acres per year is 5,150 acres. And, that just seemed awfully low. And I was thinking that, with all the conservation work that certainly my group, the Forest Society of Maine and TNC and NEF and others, we're likely to be much more than that. And so I just was wondering why we lowballed it.
So that's what the data shows over the last 20 years in Maine, that on average, year by year, that's how much area has been converted from forest to either development or agriculture, based on two separate data sources.
Yeah, and I guess to me, it read that that's our goal for conservation. And I remembered that was what the data showed for loss, but I think with the recommendation of conserving, 30% of Maine by 2030, and then just the recognition of how important it is to retain it. Anyway, it just doesn't seem right somehow.
I think it's conflating two issues. One is forest land going to be converted to non-forest uses? The other is forest land, existing forest land, going to be conserved permanently? And this table is talking about the former.
I agree, and I think there may be the opportunity to clarify so that others don't hit the question and concern that Karen did.
If you look at the language, in the box, I'm looking on page 24, box number 1 under avoided forest conversion. I guess, please, let's figure out a way to clarify this, because it just doesn't.
Karen, if you can provide better language, then go for it, and we can go from
Okay,
there.
I will. I'll work maybe with Mark on that.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
And it may be that part of this might be my problem, my error, or that I've created the problem, in that I was trying to insert somewhere logically this point that you were making at the last meeting, Karen, about, that you think that an essential piece of this is additional protection through conservation easement. It didn't strike me that was a logical bullet on its own under the, I can't remember what, under the forest practices or something, I can't remember. Oh, I think under the established forest reserves, you also thought that there should be kind of an additional bullet to speak to conservation. And
my point is not, no, I don't believe I spoke about inserting it under reserve. You included it in the text in the rest of the report, which is why I haven't raised it. But in these graphs and charts, it just, for avoided forest conversion, it just isn't making sense to me.
okay, all right, that's fine. Thank you. Did I miss someone, or were you the last comment there? Okay, let's take public comment. Anybody who's on the line who would like to comment, if you could raise your hand. And who is this? Doug Bowen, you go ahead if you could take yourself off mute. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. This was I've been really impressed with this meeting. You've really tackled a lot of hard stuff, and it's been a terrific discussion here. I just want to get to how much to increase or not increase goals for sequestered carbon by forests. As Alec was mentioning, storage is really important, whether we separate it or put it together with sequestration. About larger, older trees, part of the plan here was to do thinnings in such a way that it would encourage the growth of larger, older trees. So their growth may not slow down anywhere near as much. And in fact, when you add up storage and sequestration, they may just do better and better and better for a very long time, as well as providing much more valuable wood for those that do get cut than the undersized trees that there's so much of in Maine. Regarding the goal also of sequestration, nobody likes to talk about biomass burning, but realistically, what the recommendations for a program, what the programs eventually achieve by way of increased sequestration, is going to be measured against in the whole picture what is directly subtracted from it by burning carbon and sending it into the atmosphere. So this program aims to sequester carbon. Biomass aims, well, the result of it is to release carbon to the atmosphere. Which is going to win out in the end? Is it going to be a draw that this only compensates but does not add beyond what biomass takes away? I hear nothing about what limits there might or might never be on biomass harvesting. It's the whole picture that counts. On the issue of what kind of a program, I really like what Barry and Karen said. This should be a partnership. I think the partnership is the most important part. It means that the state has to be involved. It means that the private entity has to be involved. And we can't know yet what the share out may be, which would do what. I assume that the private entity would probably do most of the management, but there's huge ways the state needs to stay involved. For me, as a small woodland owner, the only way I'm going to trust having an incentive program with a private entity for a quarter of a century is if the state stays in enough to guarantee that that program is going to work, that the small woodland owner is going to continue to get those incentives, payments, and that the program guarantees additionality. I wouldn't be interested in a program that was like the programs we see now, where it looks like additionality is either evanescent or a downright fraud. I think a lot of small landowners are going to be thinking about these kinds of things. So I think the state has to serve as the guarantor. You know, if I own 170 acres or someone owns 50, whatever, we're not going to be able in a position to try to counter a private program that fails us. We need the state involved. Otherwise, the state will be participating in a process that harms rather than helps small woodland owners. I think a partnership suggests that it doesn't have to be, oh, we don't want the state, or oh, we don't just want a private company. We want the best of both. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Other public comments, if you want to just raise your hand. Okay. All right. Well then, let's just, I just want to make sure that you've had the opportunity to provide any final comments to Appendix A, which is the supporting materials for Section 9. And there's already been, one suggestion around this issue of avoiding forest land loss and incentivizing forest conservation. And Karen, if you were able to send me your thoughts on that as soon as possible, that would be great. Alec, go ahead.
Thank you, Adam et al. For pulling all of this information together. But as I've mentioned to you specifically, I think we need to be very clear, and I did read this over, and I'm not sure that it's really adequate in this regard, that these are first cuts, approximations to be refined, and we don't know if there is such thing as a final answer. We don't know what the final answers are yet. And I guess I would use as an example in table A1, the avoided forest land loss. And presumably here, we're talking about lands that are really, that have been the subject in the past and will be in the future to conversion. And we're saying that something less than $4,000 an acre is going to avoid that forest conversion. I haven't seen a lot of building lots that have been on the market for $4,000 an acre. So I just think that we need to be careful and let people know that these numbers are rough cuts to put us in the ballpark. They're the best we can do, but we're a long way from having really definitive numbers.
I think that if you did read it, Alec, you would find that a lot of language has been added to that effect. I think more of that language was added to Appendix B perhaps than Appendix A. So I'll leave it to Adam, your discretion, if you believe there could be value in adding anything further to Appendix A. And what I would say to you, Alec, is that, and what I would say to everybody here is that you won't have the opportunity to weigh in again in the next week. Like, I'm going to take your comments and do the best that I can to represent them accurately. And it's that version that's going to go out to the public, right, for the next 3 weeks. You're part of the public. And so if you see things in there, in this redraft that you have problems with, I would love comments from you as well, because those will then be embedded into the public comment document that you will have fed back to you prior to your final meeting. And I think it would be the most productive, sort of the most efficient way to get at that. Just reply to the public comment period and it'll be embedded in there. Karen, go ahead.
Thanks. Just so that I make sure I'm understanding this, on page 27 under A2 table, the avoided forest conversion, that appears to be the recommended #1 practice. Is that, am I reading that correctly?
These are just ordered in a way that goes back to whatever item number towards the top of the report that Jody put them in,
so
and they're sort of lumped together into different. Yeah, it's just a reference to how we have the bulleted numbers, because when we go later and try to lump them together or have them be consistent with what's earlier in the report.
Maybe there's a way to just put that, I'm sorry, Jody, it almost reads like it's the recommended practice, you know what I mean? As opposed to referring to that list. Do you see what I'm saying, Jody?
Well, if you're saying that you read it as a prioritized list, that,
Yeah.
that number 1 was most important and number 15 was least?
Well, if you read that table as a layperson, and I read this, and I also looked at the numbers, it could be interpreted to suggest that it's our number 1 recommended practice. So I guess there's a better way to say, refer to table, see table, instead of saying recommended. That's all I'm saying, just for clarity.
Well, they are the 15 recommended practices.
I know, but it looks like that's the order in which they're being
Okay.
recommended by us.
Did anybody else get?
I agree. I
Thank
understand what
you.
Karen's saying. I
Thank
think
you,
just a
Ivan.
modification-
I couldn't
Just a
hear Ivan.
modification to the title of the table, A2.
Yeah, it's
Suggesting that in
confusing.
no particular order of priority
Yeah, something.
would solve it.
Very little effort. We could just avoid that confusion. Thank you, Ivan. I'll buy you lunch.
Okay. All right. I missed, Ivan, your follow-up point about you think that that needs referencing in table 2 as well? Table 8, I'm sorry, table A2 as well needs clarification or not? Is it just A1?
Yeah, because.
My point was to table A2, Jody.
Right.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
was to table A2?
A2,
Yes.
look at it. It says recommended practice on the right-hand column. So
And to a lay reader.
The
it could
order
be
of our
making as an
recommendations.
Implication of A is A. It's, and so if it says.
Right, but so we can say based on the numbers in table A1.
yes,
Yeah,
thank you.
no
Then you guys are
particular
telling me
order.
to take stuff away from appendix. Now you're asking me to add stuff to the appendix. I can't win.
But
Okay,
we
got it.
appreciate you though.
Got it. Okay, I think I'm clear. Anything else on this appendix? Barry?
Just another quick addition for that lovely chart there. Thank you, Adam.
Table A1?
Yeah, table A1, yes. The cost there, I think Logan said that those are most of them, not the forced conversion one, but a lot of the practices were taken from NRCS cost share practices. Their current cost share rates, is that true?
No, but we've adjusted to be a 0% cost share, right? So we've taken their rate and then
Oh.
we bumped it up to what it would truly be.
Right, but
Yeah.
the foundation was the NRCS rates.
Yes.
You can maybe make a note of that, that's where
Well-
those numbers came from, because I think actually, in my experience working with those numbers all over the years, they're way over they're all over the map. I mean, some are lower than the actual cost of a practice, some are higher, and there's a certain degree of what appears to be randomness in them. So
Yep.
just make a note of where they came from.
Is this column 4 cost dollar per acre?
Yeah, and
Yeah,
then
cost per acre, yeah.
column 6 is trying to get at that, but again, I can be more clear that if it says
Yeah.
NRCS scenario, then that's where we got it from to make column 4.
Yeah,
Okay.
because those numbers are actually, I think, crunched out by someone in Washington, DC, who takes numbers from all across the country and puts them through a blender and then spits them out to the states. So I don't know how much, I don't know, maybe I'm jaded, but I don't know how much they really reflect.
Well, then Barry, I
actual
should,
reality.
yeah, you and I can have a talk after
Sure.
about if you have better costs.
No,
for my own
I mean,
knowledge,
I have,
Right? No,
No.
yeah, I will note the limitation. I agree.
or just,
Right.
just
So
say
we'll
the
just be
source
more
of the
clear.
data. Yeah.
All right, we
Thank
gotta
you.
move on. We gotta move
Yeah.
on. If there are any other things associated with Appendix A, if you could just email me this afternoon, because I realize I'm cutting off this conversation and then because of what time it is. I just want to make sure that you all saw the timeline that was in the cover email that I'll be incorporating changes next week. It'll be finalized by the end of the day Thursday. It will be available for public comment starting Friday. We will send you, it will go out to the normal channels that the Natural and Working Lands work group recommendations went out. I see you, Karen, just one sec. And so it will go out to those channels through the department. and possibly through GoPIF, I'm not quite sure, but certainly through DACF. And you'll each receive an email with the updated version, along with a template for what could be your cover email that you could send out to tailor it to your constituency. So you can spread the word that this public comment period is happening as well. And in that cover email are instructions to forward comments to Tom Doak. I'm sorry, to Tom Gordon. Did you just have a heart attack, Tom? Doak. And we'll summarize them and sort of package them in a way that feels logical. I'm not quite sure what they'll look like yet. You'll get them up to a week in advance, at least a week in advance of your final meeting. And then at that meeting, you'll be able to talk through those comments and which ones you want to incorporate. And do please reply yourselves to that draft if you are feeling like there are some major issues that you have concerns about. Karen, go ahead.
Will we get this latest version in Word like we did last time? If I have a couple little typo things or grammar,
That you want to just send it back to me that way?
It would be easier for you, I would think.
Yeah, I'll give you all that, but I don't want a Word version sent out to.
No, I'm talking about between now and when told us to get you small items.
Oh, yes. I'll ask Tom Gordon if he could do that this afternoon.
Thank you. And then I'm assuming there's no subcommittee now that's going to meet about inclusive and exclusive matters.
I think that's correct. Am I reading that wrong, Tom and Amanda? Okay. Then I think we're good. Are we good? All right.
Thank you, Jody.
So much. And
Thank you, Jody.
yeah, absolutely. All right. Have a good weekend.